Sacagewea, a sign of peace. Westward expansion. In the year 1803, the United States bought thousands of square miles of land from France in the Louisiana Purchase. This sparked much interest in westward expansion. President Thomas Jefferson convinced Congress to give him the necessary money to fund a journey to explore to the Western Ocean. Explorers were to study Native Americans, plants and animals, and the land in the region. The team of Lewis and Clark and their Corps of Discovery were chosen for this journey. The expedition lasted 4 years and covered more than 4,000 miles. However, without the help of a young Native American woman named Sacagewea, Lewis and Clark may not have survived to tell about it. Sacagawea's early life. Sacagewea was born around 1789 near present-day Montana. She lived with her Shoshone tribe on the western side of the Rocky Mountains where Idaho is today. When Sacagewea was a young girl, she was kidnapped by a group of warriors from the Hidatsa tribe. The Hidatsa often would attack the Shoshone, steal their horses, and take prisoners. Sacagewea meets Lewis and Clark. Sacagewea learned to live like Hidatsa in their village on the upper Missouri River. She helped to plant and to harvest the crops the tribe needed throughout the year. She was even given the Hidatsa name of Sacagewea, meaning bird woman. When Sacagewea was about 16, she met a French fur trader named Toussaint Charbonnet. Shortly thereafter, the two were married. Charbonnet spoke the Hidatsa language and worked as an interpreter, helping the French and British fur traders buy fur skins from the Hidatsa. In late 1804, Lewis and Clark's expedition reached the upper Missouri where Charbonnet and Sacagewea lived. On meeting the two men, Charbonnet offered to be an interpreter for the expedition. Though Lewis and Clark held Charbonnet in low esteem, they hired him because he had one asset that impressed them, Sacagewea. She spoke both the Hidatsa and Shoshone languages, and Lewis and Clark believed she would be invaluable on their journey. Heading west. In April of 1805, with an expedition of 33 strong, including Charbonnet, Sacagewea, and their infant son Jean-Baptiste, the Corps of Discovery began a new leg of their journey west. Lewis and Clark knew that the expedition would take them across the rugged Rocky Mountain terrain near Shoshone territory. Knowing she was Shoshone, Lewis and Clark hoped that Sacagewea would be able to help them buy horses from the Shoshone tribe at a good price. In the first 2 days of the journey, Sacagewea began to prove her usefulness in another surprising way. During her years at Hidatsa, she had planted and harvested many different vegetables. Not far into the journey, Sacagewea recognized and dug up root vegetables that added great nutritional value to the group's meals and no doubt helped to improve the group's health. Both Lewis and Clark kept separate journals of the expedition. In fact, most of what we know about Sacagewea comes from these writings. One recorded event had to do with Sacagawea's quick thinking. Since the group traveled by foot and by canoe, it was not uncommon for them to encounter problems. At one point, the harsh weather put the expedition in peril. The canoe in which Sacagewea, Charbonnet, and their baby were riding almost tipped over. As the men panicked and bailed water from the boat, Sacagewea remained calm and went into the water to save clothing, books, a microscope, and the captain's important journals. After the ordeal, Lewis described Sacagewea in his journal as both loyal and brave. As time went on, the trip to the mountains became much more difficult to endure. The expedition had to cross the Great Falls of the Missouri River. Although this leg of the journey covered only 18 miles because of the harsh terrain and even harsher conditions, it took an entire month. There seemed to be one disaster after another. The group had to carry their canoes and supplies around several waterfalls. The terrain was treacherous and the weather dismal. It rained profusely, sometimes for days at a time. The group was often caught unsheltered in fierce storms. Hailstorms pelted so hard that some members of the party were seriously injured. The weather grew colder each day. By the summer of 1805, Lewis and Clark still had not reached the mountains, and time was getting short. After passing the Great Falls of the Missouri River, the group found themselves on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains. There, the explorers came upon a place that looked as if the river had carved a road through solid rock. As the expedition paddled through the area, Lewis and Clark looked for signs that they were near the Shoshones. They hoped that Sacagewea would recognize the area. Lewis and Clark divided their team and set out to find the river fork that would lead them through the mountains to the Columbia River. While the men were out scouting the countryside, Sacagawea made a startling discovery. She realized that she recognized this place. Their campsite was the very place where she had been kidnapped by the Hidatsa years earlier. Lewis set off on foot with some of the men to find the Shoshone. The rest of the party traveled either by foot or by canoe with the bulk of the supplies. Then one day, as Sacagawea was walking along the shoreline, a group of Shoshones rode toward her on horseback. She watched them intently and knew that she recognized them. Sacagawea had found her people. While Sacagawea visited with her lost friends, the explorers held a council with the Shoshone chief Camelweight. When Sacagawea was called in to interpret, she was unable to speak. Instead, she fell into the arms of the chief and began to cry. Chief Camelweight was, in fact, her long-lost brother. The men stood speechless in the presence of this joyous reunion. Lewis and Clark explained their plans to the Shoshone Council. They told the chief that the United States government wanted to begin trading with Native Americans. They explained why they needed to find a route through the mountains. They presented the Shoshone with gifts from President Jefferson. In return, Chief Camelweight decided to trade for horses. He gave Lewis and Clark a detailed description of the route to follow to the Columbia River. The Shoshone explained that a water route was impossible and that they would have to cross the mountains on horseback. With the help of Sacagawea, Lewis and Clark acquired 29 horses from the Shoshone. On September 4, 1805, Sacagawea said a tearful goodbye to her brother and her people. The expedition continued on northwest across what is now Montana and Idaho, and Sacagawea continued on too. In each part of the journey, every group of Native Americans they encountered offered help. In all accounts, this was because of Sacagawea. According to Clark, to Native Americans, a woman's presence with a group of men was a sign of peace. Each time the expedition met a new group of Native Americans, the sight of Sacagawea and her son, John Baptiste, confirmed that their group was friendly and not a war party. In fact, if it hadn't been for the goodwill of the Native Americans, many in the party may not have survived. Native Americans along the way shared their food and shelter. Most importantly, they pointed the expedition in the right direction. By this time, the journey was one raging river and death-defying waterfall after another. The explorers navigated their way down the Clearwater and Snake rivers until they finally reached the Columbia River. The Columbia River led them to their goal, the Pacific Ocean. There they spent the winter. The Pacific Coast. During the long, cold winter along the Pacific coastline, Sacagawea was again resourceful. Over the length of the journey, most of their clothing had become worn and rotted. Using animal skins and her sewing skills, Sacagawea made new shirts and moccasins for the members of the expedition. As spring approached, Lewis and Clark and their party were ready to return home and report on their findings. They had left St. Louis, Missouri in May of 1804. In March of 1806, they began the long trip back. Once the snow had melted, Lewis and Clark followed new trails back in order to explore the Yellowstone River. On the way, they saw many of the same people who had helped them along their journey. On their return, Lewis and Clark prepared their report for President Jefferson. A small delegation from the expedition accompanied them to Washington, D.C. The rest of the group disbanded. Charbonnet was paid $500 for his services to Lewis and Clark. Sacagawea, on the other hand, was paid nothing at all. Remembering Sacagawea. Sacagawea made a great contribution to Lewis and Clark's expedition. In their journals, they recorded what they saw. They described close to 200 types of fruits, flowers, and trees. Many of these Sacagawea had told them about. They also included drawings of more than 100 animals that at the time were undocumented. These included coyotes, porcupines, and prairie dogs, which were all unfamiliar to Lewis and Clark but were recognizable to Sacagewea. No one really knows what happened to Sacagewea, although legends and stories give different accounts about the remainder of her life. Some say she returned to the Shoshone and became a revered elder, living to be almost 100 years old. Others say she died shortly after her return from the expedition in South Dakota. More important than the age at which she died was the spirit in which Sacagewea lived. Without her calm, kind, and resourceful ways, we may never have known the success of Lewis and Clark's expedition.